Bienvenidos, and greetings to our virtual audience joining us from across the country, and to all of you right here in Los Angeles, California. Welcome to the 2022 HACR Executive Programs, featuring Latino experts and thought leaders who have successfully navigated the corporate world. Our program this morning has been generously sponsored by Anheuser-Busch, Ford Motor Company, Liberty Mutual, and Target. Now, welcome to the stage, the Hispanic Association on Corporate Responsibility's Senior Vice President of Operations, Sylvia Perez Cash.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed breakfast, had a little time for cafecitos, whatever you need to do to wake up in the morning. It is truly my pleasure to welcome you here to the first full day of our 2022 HACR Executive Programs. I want to thank each and every one of you who are here in the room with us today, and I also want to give a special thanks to those who are attending via live stream on our live stream platform. So thank you to everyone who is here. First, let me say, I was so inspired by last night's conversation. This fireside chat between Patty Juarez of Wells Fargo, one of our title sponsors, as well as Jai Vargas, HACR's Vice President of Strategic Engagement and Initiatives. I couldn't wait to come back to see what else we had in store, right? The lineup is phenomenal, the conversations are going to be great, and I just felt it was a perfect way to start our time together. So I want to give another thank you to them. Today will be about managing business in a rapidly changing world. We will discuss risk management in the post-pandemic environment with Dean Kingsley, Risk and Financial Advisory Principal with Deloitte. We'll learn about the attributes of effective leadership from the President and CEO of the Corporate Playbook, Deb Elam. We will enjoy the candor and insights of fireside chats with HACR's distinguished guests, the Honorable Rosie Rios, former Treasurer of the United States, and Ann Chow, the CEO of AT&T Business. But wait, that's not all. We will listen in on a discussion on resilience in global consumer markets with Pablo Lacharga, the Vice President of Business Planning and Integration at the Coca-Cola Company, another one of our title sponsors for our time together. And they are also a longtime partner, of course, of HACR in our work to advance Hispanic inclusion. And you won't want to miss out on the dynamic closing Latina Influencer Roundtable. Gina Maybach, a Managing Director of Bank of America, will moderate a conversation with the heads of chambers of commerce from both our coasts. Angela Franco, the CEO of the DC Chamber of Commerce, and Maria Salinas, the CEO of the LA Chamber of Commerce. That one I also can't wait for. Throughout the day, of course, we hope you'll capture and share your favorite sessions with the world by using our hashtag HACREP22 on social media. And double, of course, make sure you spend some time connecting with each other. That's a large part of why we're here together today. Don't forget those people online. We have our Bizzabo app, where if you weren't taking copious notes of the day's agenda, you can also access it on the app, but you can access the whole community there as well. People are readily available. They're listening, they're chatting, and they want to connect with you. So take some time to meet them. And with that, we will get started. So for our first session of the day, I'm honored to introduce Dean Kingsley. He's going to be speaking to the risk management in a post-pandemic environment. We asked him this question: as executive leaders, what can you do to enhance your company's risk management strategy so that you instill trust? Should I give you a hint to what he said? No, I won't. That wouldn't be any fun, but he will fill you in. So I hope you're excited. He has 30 years of experience in corporate governance, business risk, and internal controls. He specializes in advising global clients in media, entertainment, and the information and technology industries. He works closely with board members, C-suite executives, operational managers, regulators, and others on complex strategic, operational, and regulatory issues. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Dean Kingsley.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks for letting me be the way we kick off the day. Sounds like you've got an exciting day set up. I really appreciate Sylvia and HACR inviting me to come and join you today and talk about what I think is a pretty challenging topic at 9 a.m., which is what's going on in the world and how should your organizations respond. Because there's an awful lot going on in the world, if you haven't noticed. I'm sure you have, and I'm sure your organizations have. And so I'm going to spend about 40 minutes talking through some observations I have about how organizations and how you as executives can deal with all the uncertainty in the world that's going on right now, and how you can build risk management programs that can ensure you survive, but ensure you thrive through what is a very, very challenging time that you're all facing and we're all facing together. We're going to allow lots of time for Q&A at the end, so I'm sure there may be particular risk topics that your organization is dealing with or you personally are dealing with that you want to dive into. Happy to take those questions and cover whatever it is you all want to cover. So I'll make some initial remarks for a half an hour or so, and then we'll make sure that you've got plenty of time to focus on what you want to focus on. But thank you for inviting me here this morning. The first thing I would say is that we used to talk about something called VUCA to describe the world that we're in. Volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. That really is no longer adequate to describe the world we live in. One of my colleagues this morning I was talking to described it as chaos, and that's probably the best word to describe the business and societal environment that we're all living in right now. So with that, in this kind of chaotic environment that we're all living in, how do you make sense of it? How do you synthesize it? How do you do something about it to make sure that your organization can, again, not just survive through that chaos, but thrive through that chaos? And it's certainly not easy. And I would say that in most corporate executives' living memory, certainly mine, I've been working at Deloitte for 35 years, I've never seen an environment that's so difficult to understand, so difficult to predict, so difficult to prepare for, and so difficult to respond to. And I would say that most executives that I deal with feel very similarly, that there really aren't the sort of simultaneous challenges that we're facing today, that hasn't occurred really in living memory of the current breed of business executives. We have at my company, and I'm sure you have at all your organizations, lots of millennials who haven't even dealt with 10% of everything that's going on in the world today and need strong leadership and strong guidance to help them understand how they can personally survive and thrive and how they can help the organization survive and thrive. So if we move into some examples of that, I just wanted to start off by talking about 6 things that have happened in the past week. Back in the day, like pre-COVID, we used to think in sort of terms of months and years and decades in terms of significant change, and now we think in terms of days and weeks, which is part of our challenge, the speed with which things are moving. So I just wanted to focus on a few things. Last week, many of you are aware, and in fact, I heard you had a speaker yesterday that may have covered this. The inflation rate for 1 month was 1%. I grew up in a very high inflation environment at the beginning of my business career, but haven't lived in one for more than 20 years. I believe that was the highest inflation in the US in over 40 years. So again, in the living memory of most executives and most board members, we've never dealt with an inflationary environment like the one that we're currently facing. And there's no sign it's going to change anytime soon. I'll come into what might happen in the next week in a minute. But then the second thing I would note is that we entered bear market territory for the first time in quite a while, certainly the first time since the COVID dip yesterday. The S&P 500 was down more than 20%. Recovered a little bit today, but it's going to continue to be a very bumpy ride for equity values and more generally asset values. But I would also kind of talk societally about the fact that there were some pretty big protests around the country at the weekend about the situation in Uvalde and all the issues that are wrapped up in gun violence, particularly gun violence at schools. And that, I think, is interesting in terms of the direction that regulation might take and the impact that will have on multiple industries, not just education and the gun industry, but many industries. And then I guess if we stay close to home here in LA, we had another wildfire yesterday up in the mountains near a ski resort. And that's been a continuation, I guess, of a wildfire season that's no longer a season. It's now just wildfires all year long, all the time. I'm sure any of you who are local, I know you've come from around the country, but for those of you who are local, you'll remember that about 3 or 4 weeks ago, about 80 houses burnt down in Orange County in a major wildfire in a very highly populated area of very expensive houses. And so I think the whole issue of sort of natural disasters is very closely twinned with the issue of climate change. And so I'll come on to a news story I saw last night that perhaps brings together many of the threads of what's challenging at the moment. 50 million people are on the brink of starvation, so food security is at an all-time low. And there are many drivers for that, but a key one is that Ukraine turned out to be one of the primary providers of grain to the entire world, not just to Europe. And obviously there's been huge disruption as a result of them being engaged in a months-long war with Russia. And other countries thought that they would step into that breach. India was one of them. India was going to be able to match some of that supply chain challenge that was created by the Ukraine war. But they have suffered the hottest winter in recorded memory that's killed all of their crops, all of their grains. And they're now in a situation where they will not export anything because otherwise their own people are going to die. And so they've basically forbidden exports of grains and other forms of food from India, meaning that the markets that relied on that to replace the food that was no longer coming from Ukraine will either not have food or will need to find it from somewhere else. And so to me, there's something frighteningly risk-related in that story, which is this idea of interconnectivity, the idea of sort of systemic risk, the idea of how risks connect to each other, and that we can't just think about climate change as an issue on its own. We can't think about geopolitical conflict as an issue on its own. We can't think about supply chain dependencies in isolation. Each of those are complex issues in their own right, but the way that they all interrelate probably just adds to the complexity. And so that's just the last week. What about the next week? Well, we have a Fed decision on interest rates tomorrow, and the prediction is they're going to raise by 0.75%. And so that's going to have a significant impact, potentially further worsening inflation. And it's going to be interesting to see, obviously, what the cost of credit does, both in the personal environment we all live in with our mortgages, but also in the work environments that we live in, and how that spreads across the cost of capital. So interesting times ahead, I guess, financially. We're not that far away from getting the GDP result for the last month. People remember last month, GDP was down. So if GDP is down this month, we're officially in a recession. So we're all waiting to see if the recession that everyone fears is actually going to arrive or not. On the flip side, there looks like there's prospect of some significant regulation in response to the Uvalde situation at a political level, something I'm sure many people would not have predicted in terms of cross-aisle collaboration. And so every uncertainty comes with upside and downside, and that's the whole basis of risk management, again, is it's not enough just to be able to be good at predicting or preparing for all the things that might happen that are bad. It's a matter of working out how you take advantage of the things that are good, how you create good, how you thrive, and how you create enterprise value in a very turbulent environment. So that's really what I want to cover today. And I've only got a few slides really that I want to focus on. There's a longer deck that people can peruse at their leisure. But the key talking points for me today are risk management is not a process, it's not an event, certainly not a one and done. It's a thought process. It's a way of thinking about your business, your challenges, your opportunities in a different way, in a way that attempts to smooth out the bumps, and overall improve the performance by having fewer dips in your performance and more peaks in your performance. It's not about trying to stop bad things happening. Yes, it includes the idea of stopping bad things happening, because bad things are, particularly the ones you do to yourself, are a very bad idea. They destroy value with no upside. But it's actually about making the right things happen. It's about taking the right risks. And so this quote to me kind of captures all of those ideas bundled together, that really, risk management done well, it's about outcomes. It's about a better organization because of bringing risk management thinking and risk management principles to the discussion and to the executive table and the board table. I guess we've covered some of these challenges. I won't drain the slide and cover them all, but probably the one I want to add to kind of the outside environment, what's going on in the world that impacts your organization, I would probably add just one thing about what's going on inside your company. and that is that the expectation of all of your stakeholders, obviously not just shareholders if you're a company, but stakeholders more broadly, your customers, suppliers, society, your employees, are multifaceted, complex, and growing. And so this idea of responsible capitalism, this idea of stakeholder capitalism, I think has fundamentally changed how organizations see themselves operating. Not just for-profit and not just public companies, but generally organizations, I think, are thinking about themselves quite differently because of that broad set of stakeholder expectations and how they're changing. And then I'll probably just quickly tack on to that, this idea of sort of regulatory expectation about risk management. So there are many drivers for that. There are organizations, obviously, that are highly regulated where not following the rules obviously comes with consequences, including losing the right to operate. But I would also talk about the very significant regulatory reform that's going on in corporate America, particularly in the industry that I serve, the tech industry, to further regulate, or you might argue for the first time, regulate large chunks of that industry. But with every large regulatory reform comes unintended consequences, and so there are some drivers of why the country believes that's important. But the challenge is, how do you craft legislation that gets those outcomes and doesn't drive other negative outcomes? And then lastly, I'd probably go to directors' liability, something that seems to be driving almost every risk management conversation I've had in the last few months, has been the very real and direct personal risk that boards of directors are feeling. And again, doesn't matter if they're for-profit, public company, NYSE listed, or if they're a not-for-profit. Every director is feeling this sense of weight of expectation from all of those stakeholders, but also their own personal legal liability. And that's driven by many things. It's driven by the listing rules of the exchange they're on, if you're in a public company, if you're domiciled in Delaware or headquartered in Delaware, then you're subject to case law in Delaware, which continues to err on the side of demanding more from corporations, more from directors personally, about oversight and diligence. And so there's a lot going on, I think, that's driving the bar up, making good risk management look a lot more challenging than it used to look. I want to sort of talk about if you were going to design a risk management program from scratch today, and I get to work with companies that do that. Either they didn't exist 10 years ago, and they're through the process of maturing, when other companies have had decades to do that. They were private and now they're public, and they feel a much stronger sense of direct obligation to do that. They're becoming regulated. Again, many drivers. So I do work with companies that actually start with a blank sheet of paper, but obviously many organizations that you represent in the room won't start with a blank sheet of paper. You'll be starting with a program you already have and working out how to make it better. But if you were starting with a blank sheet of paper, I would suggest to you that these would be some great goals to have for how you would build a program. You would build it so it focused on making good things happen, not just stopping bad things happening. So it changed decision making and the way that people thought about and talked about how to make business decisions. And it would focus on a broad range of risks, including those that are very uncertain, very hard to predict, and very hard to manage. It wouldn't just focus on compliance risks and operational risks that are in your control and easy to manage. It would focus on the broad landscape of risks that are going to impact your organization positively and negatively. And that's the challenge I see many of my clients taking on at the moment is, how do I get a risk program that doesn't kind of focus on a once-a-year risk assessment and focus on the things only that we can control and assume that we can control everything? How do we get a much more mature set of risks, a much more mature set of capabilities and risk mitigations that deal with risks we can manage, risks we can't, risks we need to prepare for, risks we need to respond to? And it's really in that regard that I'll offer this slide up. So unless the risk team comes in and talks about strategy, the CEO doesn't want to talk. And I think a lot of risk teams and risk functions have got great at following COSO or following ISO and having this great complex process. It may be enabled by a GRC platform. It could be very automated. But it's not related to strategic objectives. It's not talking to the most important issues the company is grappling with. How do I grow? How do I retain customers? How do I avoid churn? How do I innovate new products and services? How do I deal with traditional competition? How do I deal with disruptive competition, competitors we haven't historically competed with? How do I deal with business model transformation in my industry? That's obviously what the CEO and many operational executives in your companies, and perhaps many of you in the room, are actually grappling with. And so risk management, to be relevant, has to be a process that can actually answer those questions and help people more successfully answer those questions than they could just do without a risk management process. I know this is a busy slide, and again, people can take this away and kind of reflect on it, but the commentary I'd offer on this sort of bubble diagram, as we call it, is this idea that risk management done well is an interesting intersection of different arts and sciences. I guess there's futurology on the left, what's happening in the outside world that I need to prepare for or predict or respond to. There is strategy, what is it my company is doing, and what assumptions do the strategies of my company make about what has to go right or what will happen in the outside world? And how could I use risk management to help validate those assumptions and manage and monitor those assumptions? And then at the bottom, it's kind of traditional process and risk and controls. How do I set up a process to monitor all the risks that we need to manage and who's managing them and make sure that stuff gets done? And so that's a really interesting and somewhat uncomfortable soup of art and science that's trying to come together, I think, in effective and modern risk management. But a program that doesn't achieve all those three goals is not a good risk management program, certainly not one that's going to help an organization survive and thrive in the complex world we find ourselves in. So just quickly covering each of those bubbles. The top, the one that's on the top, the dark green bubble, is all about parsing your organization's strategy to understand what must go right, and then identifying all the things that could get in the way of those things going right, and then making sure that they don't happen. That's another way of saying, again, what must go right, helping what must go right go right. And that is not done through a risk register or a risk steering committee or assigning ownership of remediation to risk owners or all the things we traditionally think about as risk management. That comes through a dialogue, a discussion, an analytical thought process, and a seat at the table. Obviously, a risk management team and a risk management function can't help senior executives with those problems if they're not in the place where those decisions are made and those issues are discussed, which is the executive table. And there are a lot of risk professionals that don't have a seat at the executive table. And so they need to develop the skills to make themselves relevant to the executive table so they get an invite to go and talk about all those issues. The other thing I think that would give them more relevance to the executive table is the lighter green bubble that's on the left. That talks to the idea that there are many, many things outside your control. We used to call them black swans, if you remember that terminology. We stopped using that terminology some time ago, and the reason is that there's really no unknown unknowns. Will pandemics happen? Yes. Will global hot wars happen? Yes. Will geopolitical tension and trade wars happen? Absolutely. Will economies go down? For sure. We don't know when, we don't know where, we don't know exactly what shape it will take, but there really is nothing that we can genuinely say will never happen. So the idea of a black swan doesn't exist. There are only grey swans in the current environment. So everything is, to some extent, predictable, monitorable, measurable, and certainly respondable. And so this idea of how do we develop the muscle in our organization to get better at monitoring, but more importantly, get better at responding as risks crystallize. And so this idea of kind of preparedness over prediction is really, really important. I have some idea, and most of my clients do, about all the things that could happen that would most impact them positively or negatively. But it's not, there's no prize for getting that right. The prize ultimately is business success. It's really about when what happens is different than what you thought would happen, how do you respond to that? None of us were predicting a global pandemic of exactly the sort that we got with COVID. There have been pandemics before, there will be pandemics again. Obviously, we all know about the Spanish flu in 1918. But there have been many others, Ebola and other things, that have impacted the US as well as other countries around the world. But nothing that had the level of supply chain disruption and workplace disruption, workforce disruption, societal disruption that COVID has had. And we weren't ready for it. We weren't ready for it at the governmental level. We weren't ready for it at the societal level. Most organizations didn't have plans for it. And so the organizations that have been able to survive and thrive through COVID are those that were incredibly responsive. Were very quick to understand what was going to happen, what the likely trajectory was, and where they most needed to focus on changing what they did and how they did it. You could think about organizations that have benefited from COVID, pharmaceutical industry, and a company like Moderna in the speed. They were a relatively small pharmaceutical company prior to COVID. So they determined that their future was going to be in quickly innovating the vaccine solution to COVID, and both in the process helping society and helping themselves as an organization. Zoom was practically unknown and certainly a very small competitor in the video conference market prior to COVID. But by dint of the way in which they innovated their products and also promoted their products through the pandemic and spoke about sort of permanent change to a hybrid workforce rather than this is a great tool for connecting people in offices, they were able again to not only survive but thrive. So with that, I just want to make the point that prediction is not the goal, and really preparedness is the goal, and having a great muscle in your organization that you regularly flex about how to respond to things that surprise you. The bottom white circle is the own goals, the stupid things that you do to yourself that you get absolutely no reward from the market for. The market pings you every time you do those silly things because you shouldn't do them. And they're the easiest. And a risk management program that can't manage those is not a risk management program. That is product launch failures, that is compliance issues, that is HR issues, and there's really just no excuse for getting those things wrong. Another quote here, and you might say this is blindingly obvious, stay focused on what's important. How is this useful advice? I see a lot of risk management programs. In fact, I had a conversation with a client yesterday who said, I'm going to conduct a risk assessment and I want to find the 50 top risks in my organization. And I said, and what are you going to do with that information? What are you going to do with 50 risks? This is, by the way, this is a company that's less than $2 billion in revenue and has about 1,500 employees. I said, exactly what are you going to do with 50 risks? Are you going to try and simultaneously put significant time, money, effort, focus, attention, dollars into managing 50 risks? There'll be a huge difference in the impact to your organizational performance and value from managing number 1 to managing number 50. Why would you do that to yourself? But you'll be surprised how often people assume that the best risk management process is to have lots of risks and have lots of registers and lots of spreadsheets, and to feel like you're really doing something, you're really making a difference here. In fact, you'd be much better off just working out what the top 3 or 5 issues are and doing something really substantive and really quickly about those than you would in taking 3 years to pretend to do something about 50. But again, I'm bringing this up only because so many organizations do make that mistake, usually with the best of intentions. There are so many risks we're facing. I must have to have a very long list of risks that I've understood and prioritized and assigned owners to. No, you really don't. You just got to iterate quickly. I want to talk about how do you build an ERM program that deals with everything we've been describing today that's hard about the world and hard about getting it right. And the answer is that ultimately it's a combination of many features, largely built top-down by saying somebody has to care. There has to be sponsorship from this at the most senior levels of the organization to say, I think risk management's got something useful to share with us. I don't mean the team, I mean the thought process, I mean the capability. I really like the idea of something that can tie together, the strategy of the company and the kind of the futurology of what's happening in the outside world with the predictability of managing our own goals and pull that together into a coherent whole. I think that's useful. I really like somebody who can examine the assumptions that we're all just making about why our strategies are going to succeed and actually parsing those to see what assumptions could be wrong or what assumptions may change and how we would need to change our strategies in response to that. I want an organization that's going to help us flex that muscle of being incredibly good at responding to surprising events that occur. I think that could be really helpful. And you may say, isn't that obvious? I mean, isn't every organization in a post-COVID world going, well, COVID proved that we definitely need to be better at all these things? I reflect back, I was working in San Francisco in 1989. And I don't know if any of you are from San Francisco or remember what happened in 1989. A very large earthquake happened, and it destroyed significant parts of the city and certainly disrupted businesses in a very significant way. And what was interesting about talking to organizations about risk in the aftermath of that natural disaster was, hey, we survived the earthquake. We obviously must be really good at doing what we're doing. You know, we must actually have great process or great decision making, great responsiveness. We must be really good at this, so there's really nothing more we need to do. This idea of I'm now bulletproof, I'm hearing it all again post-COVID. We got through COVID, what else could happen? Nothing could be as bad as COVID. I can assure you there are many things that could be worse than COVID, particularly to American organizations. I could name 10 of them today. So I think this idea of kind of complacency is one of the key challenges. And so this idea of sponsorship at the top, to me, is the sort of most important part of an effective risk program. The processes and technologies and activities that sit underneath that are the easy part. It's getting the organization engaged and wanting to actively pull through this skill set, this capability. That's the key issue. I know I've been talking a lot about risk, individual risks. I haven't really given you a framework to think about all the risks. And I know I gave you advice before that you shouldn't try to manage all the risks, but you should be thinking about all the risks whenever you try to work out which ones are the most important and you want to manage. We have a framework called FOREST. It did used to be a forest with one T, and like Forrest Gump, now it's a forest with two Ts. And we're still struggling to work out how we better reflect ESG in this model. So we're debating whether we need to have two E's as well. And so this idea, again, of the volatility, the velocity of change of risks is even reflected in our own taxonomy, the way that we think about what are all the risks that our clients need to think about and manage. We obviously have a model sitting underneath this of all the things that make up each of these categories, but most of them are pretty self-explanatory. Obviously, financial risks are partly externally imposed about the inflation environment, cost of credit, macroeconomic environment, growth, and so on, but they're also internally focused about your leverage of your organization and what particular exposures you have, particular customer markets that you're exposed to the economic volatility of, if you're in particular vertical markets, and so on down the list. The one I would probably call out just very quickly is reputational. For a long time in the risk management world, people said, well, reputation is an outcome. If I make good decisions and do good things, I'll have a good reputation, and if I make bad decisions and bad things happen to us, obviously our reputation will suffer. Actually, reputation is a type of risk you can analyze and manage. You can think about stakeholders, you can think about proactive steps that you can take. You don't just have to wait and hope that good or bad things happen. So in all these categories, there are some interesting nuances to the risks, and I'm happy to share with anyone who would like it the further detail that sits behind that in our risk taxonomy. So how do you get from where you are to where you need to be? Well, it depends. Like I said, lots of companies are starting with blank sheets of paper. Lots of companies have a process, but in their view, it's adding so little value, they want to start with a blank sheet of paper. So you can either start by assessing what's good and bad about what you're doing, or you can just acknowledge that it's a long way from where you want to be and say, how do we design a new process from the outset that would be more likely to give us the outcomes that we've been talking about today? And again, this risk journey, we've got clients at all points on this journey, and clients that are very mature but want to get much better at risk sensing and risk prediction, want to be much more data-driven, less qualitative, more quantitative. And so, depending on where your program's at, there's lots of things that you can still do. We have a maturity model for risk management that says that the top level of maturity, level 5 maturity in risk management, requires about 50 capabilities. We don't have any clients that have those 50 capabilities today, so there's always things to challenge yourself to improve. So just closing out, what are we talking about in terms of risk management? We're talking about, how do you win, how do you survive and thrive, not just survive? How do you do that in a way where you're managing the complete set of risks, including the ones that you can't control and that are hard to understand? How do you do that with a process that's very responsive and agile? How do you not boil the ocean? Cycle times these days for understanding and managing risk are weeks and months. They're not years as they used to be. And then ultimately, how do you help your organization make better decisions? And if you feel like if you feel like you're working for an organization that has those answers already, I'd take my hat off to you, and I'd love to talk more to you about how you've done that. I think in most organizations, the recognition is there's more work to do. And if there wasn't more work to do, then we wouldn't have had COVID. I don't mean there wouldn't have been a virus. I mean it wouldn't have had the massive impact around the world that it did. You'd argue we wouldn't have had the global financial crisis in 2009, and. I mean, let's pick any event. We wouldn't have all the cyber events that go on around corporate America and the world, and so on and so on. I just want to take a few minutes, and then we'll move into Q&A, just a couple of minutes, to talk about this idea that bad things will always happen. No matter how great you are at predicting and preparing, no matter how good your risk management process is, bad things are still going to happen. And so this idea of how you get great at being able to respond to those is traditionally the domain of crisis management. And the idea traditionally in crisis management is you have lots of really detailed plans. Also, if it relates to sort of how you keep your business running, business continuity is the other capability that kind of ties into this, and resilience. So the idea is we have these really detailed plans, and we pull out the right plan, right? This event number 473 happened. Let's pull out the event number 473 plan. As we saw in COVID, most people didn't have a COVID plan. Most people don't have a plan for most of the events that happen. Even in cyber security, where you would say that the number of things that are happening at the moment would give you a strong chance of predicting what might happen to your organization. It could be a ransomware, it could be the theft of data or a data privacy incident that you cause. So even there, where you might say there's 7 or 8 scenarios, and surely we can just write a plan for each of them, it turns out to be much better at responding than it does to planning. So I just really wanted to cover that for a second and give you some thoughts to take away on this idea of what do we do when it doesn't work? What do we do when it goes wrong? My company was involved in fact, one of my current colleagues was managing on the client side what we were doing as an advisor around the Sony hack, if all of you remember, about 6 years ago. The organization was hacked, but in a way that basically meant that they couldn't run any of their systems, pay any of their people, make any movies or television, but also they couldn't talk to each other. So the email didn't work. And they had to shut the systems down because they weren't sure how far the attack had gone and exactly what had been stolen or damaged. So they shut all their systems down, and so their only way to communicate was by cell phone or other public methods, but they didn't have a register of everyone's cell phone number. And so it's some really simple things. You kind of assume that, well, if something bad happens, we'll send an email or we'll IM each other on Slack, and we'll just get together in a room and it'll all be great. Yeah, the problem is you've got to know that there's a problem, and you've got to be able to have some way to get together, and then you need some information to actually base your decision-making on, and you shouldn't assume it's always going to be there when you want it. The other thing I would say is that this idea of knowing what it is in the organization that has to come back first, again, this is traditionally the domain of business continuity planning, it hasn't changed. I mean, if an organization doesn't know how to deal with, or which customers to deal with first, or what parts of its product process need to be recovered first, then you'll try and do everything and fail. And so this idea of actually understanding your business well enough and all the dependencies to make sure you know in what order you should respond to crises that impact different parts of your organization is not a new idea, but it's surprising how often people assume they'll just bring everything back when they can't, because it could take months. Which is another point. You can't run in crisis mode forever. I have clients frequently dealing with cyber crises that last for months. The Sony incident lasted for about a year. And it's incredibly draining to the organization, and people get sick of it and quit. And so the people you're relying on the most to be able to recover your business and keep it running are the ones who are not there to do it. So this idea of getting good at simultaneously running your business in some sort of crisis mode while also recovering your business so that you can get out of crisis mode and get back to business as usual is actually a little bit harder than you might think it is. And then I think this idea that it takes a village is kind of interesting. I think in any decent crisis, you always identify that that there's more help available to you from your suppliers, more patience from your customers, more governmental support than you might expect or predict. And so this idea of how do I build those relationships before an event occurs rather than after an event occurs is obviously an opportunity for companies to get better at. And then the last thing I would say is, again, this capability, this ability inside companies will only occur, if the company wants it to. If the company thinks that it's important to prepare for things going wrong. I do have clients that think that they are so great at risk management that nothing will ever go wrong. And it's usually pretty easy to dispel that on the basis of just talk about the latest cyber attack. Cyber is always a great place to go to if you want to prove that it's very, very difficult to stop all bad things happening. I just want to quickly close with a quote if I can. There's a couple of other things you can get in the slides later on, but I'll just close with this particular quote, and it seems kind of appropriate. It's a quote by Eisenhower, obviously in the context of the Second World War. Just to remind everybody, a quick statistic, twice as many people have died so far in the US from COVID as died during the entire Second World War. And so that is a kind of a sobering statistic. But his comment, and we believe it very strongly in the risk and crisis world, is that the plans are useless, but the planning is great. And so the thought process, the ability to respond to change circumstances, knowing who's going to make which decisions, is actually what's critical to be effective in managing a crisis. So with that, those are the thoughts I wanted to share, and I'm now at exactly the end of my time and happy to take questions.
Hi, Mr. Kingsley. My name is Daniel, and I have a question because I was on the forest model. Now you added a T for talent.
Yes.
And I saw when you were sharing the bubbles of things that could go wrong, you had a bubble on the left part about D&I and diversity being one of those. Given
Yes.
this is a round of executives where we think about talent a lot,
Yes.
can you just elaborate more, provide more color of how you are, why you added first the T on that model? What was the understanding to adding talent as a risk? And how can we think about, from a Hispanic perspective, about risk?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Daniel. I think talent issues or talent risks impact all three bubbles. So there is some strong assumptions about talent underpinning any organization's strategies about growth and new markets and new products. So for a lot of my tech companies, the key way that they frame the talent risk is about what do we have to get right about attracting and retaining talent in order to be able to build the products we want, attract the customers we want, enter the markets that we want to enter. So that's kind of one lens on it. I think the gray swan lens on talent is, as you rightly pointed out, societal changes in expectation. What it is that millennials, as a kind of a generation, expect from an employer or from an employment relationship. The idea of obviously lifetime work is now a relic of the past. It's this idea of a series of sequential experiences, certainly workplace flexibility. And so this idea that there is kind of things happening in demographically and societally that you can't control, you can only predict and respond to, is an important part of it. I think when it comes to DE&I more directly, there's obviously a lot of regulatory reform going on. Of course, there's recent SEC rules about disclosures for ESG that have included disclosures in relation to DE&I. There is a lot of voluntary reporting going on from organizations about DE&I. I mean, we're a partnership, a private company, so we make external reports about our DE&I progress, even though we have no regulatory obligation to do so, because one, it's the right thing to do, and two, our stakeholders expect that we will. And so I would say it's in the top 5 risks of every company I deal with, but each of them maybe have a slightly different lens about where they want to come at the challenge from. I think in terms of the Hispanic community and thinking particularly about DE&I issues there, I just reflect on our own company and the way that we approach it, and it's, I think, pretty similar for most of my clients. Our focus used to be probably on gender balance and the idea that women are severely underrepresented at the most senior levels of our organization, and again, the same is true in most of America. And some time ago, thankfully, we made enough progress on that issue to say we're not going to stop focusing on that issue. We're not going to stop with the initiatives that we have. But in fact, there's now a much bigger issue for us, which is underrepresented minorities, and that includes the Hispanic community, along with a number of other underrepresented communities in our business. And so in order to understand that, we had to understand, well, structurally, what is it about the way we operate, or either what we do or how we do it, that is somehow an impediment to all of society being represented in our company, not just a part of society. And we realized that that starts systemically at the education level, because the sort of people we require have to have certain skills and certain qualifications that have to come from certain educational institutions. In order to get into those, you have to have certain structural opportunities that there are many communities that don't have, and I would absolutely include the Hispanic community. And that really led us to the conclusion that unless we get to the beginning of the supply chain, there's no point in trying to fiddle around at the end. Okay, no worries. So with that, I would say that, realizing why you need to do it, and then I think the structured analysis to try and get to the real root cause issue is something I know we've challenged ourselves to do at Deloitte, and something we challenge our clients to do. So I'm not sure if that helps. Please, go ahead.
Hi, Dean. Thanks for the discussion. Very interesting. I'm Robert with Bank of America.
Hi, Robin.
My question's related to climate risk.
Yes.
It's something in the financial industry, regulations are kind of going up, disclosures are going up. I'm wondering, outside of finance in the tech industry, how has that climbed the risk ladder for you in the boardrooms and in your discussions outside of an industry like mine?
Generally, it's number one for most of the clients that I'm dealing with. Either, again, by weight of societal and stakeholder expectation, or from a regulatory perspective, or because of the recognition that either they are contributing to the problem or will be significantly impacted by it. And so, organizations, in my experience, are taking this very seriously. As you say, it's very multifaceted, so what it is a company needs to do and should do is different depending on where they fit within the problem. And in particular, I guess many of my clients have been able to separate the idea of, are they contributing to causing climate change, or are they a recipient of climate change, and there will be significant negative repercussions they need to understand and manage. In the banking industry would be an example of that, where obviously credit practices would be an example of the former. But you would argue real estate decisioning is an example of the latter. And I think most of the clients that I'm dealing with are going through the same thought process about how do we not be part of the problem, and then how do we respond to the problem if others aren't able to change the trajectory of the problem. I would say it's been surprising to me how quickly that worm has turned. I mean, if you went back even a year ago, I mean, yes, of course, we were more focused on COVID then, but go back 2.5 years before COVID. It was an issue, I mean, and I'm not even going to talk about the political environment, obviously, but yeah, it was an issue that just didn't have the same resonance inside companies. And so I don't know, I mean, this issue has been a really important issue for 20 years, but for some reason, corporate America has only started talking about it in the last year, but at least there's been a change, a significant one.
We have another one right over here.
Hello, I'm Pablo Largacha. I'm with the Coca-Cola Company. My question is about activism.
Yes.
Internal activism, external stakeholder activism.
Yes.
Even if you're focused on a reduced number of key risks, usually nowadays we're seeing lots of companies facing, through activism, the need to focus on issues that probably were not in that immediate circle of influence, and having to respond to those. Could be, I don't know, voting rights, LGBTQ, gun rights, and asking the companies to take a public position on it. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on how to manage when a company takes a public stance on those types of issues that are not that close, but to employees today are very important?
Yeah, in my mind, and thank you, Pablo, for the question, you kind of answered the question in the same way that I would, which is there are many, many reasons why corporations, if we talk specifically about corporations and normally regarded as having only a profit motive and only a responsibility to shareholders, would want to proactively manage those various forms of activism that you mentioned. So, regulatory obligation is one, direct business impact is another, but, expectations of your employees as a particular stakeholder group in most of my clients, and in fact for that matter at Deloitte, is probably the number one driver of that. We have lots of open debates amongst our partner group about whether we've gone too far as an organization in forming views about hot topics, about hot potato issues. And our CEO has a very strong view. His name's Joe Kazoglu. Joe is very passionate on this topic, which is we need to be an organization that does the right thing for many stakeholders, most notably our employees. So obviously we're very good at taking care of our owners, the partners. We're very good at taking care of our clients. We need to be equally good at taking care of the needs of our employees and the needs of the societies that we operate in, that we wouldn't have a license to operate if we didn't support those societies. And so this idea of employees as an activist group that need to be actively embraced and responded to, and that the organization should take positions around issues that reflect the will of its employee base. In our case, that's about 60% millennial, is really, really important. And I see the same thing in my clients, wanting to really understand this is a talent issue as much as it is a kind of a corporate relations or PR issue, which is the wrong way to think about it. Absolutely. So thank you for that.
So we have a question from our virtual audience.
Yes.
So here it is. What was the common denominator of a positive result for companies in general after COVID?
Common denominator of companies that thrived through COVID. Good luck in some cases, particularly for tech companies that thrived on the kind of the inside world where we all had to live at home. I mentioned Zoom before. There are others that we could think of that were in the right place at the right time. But you've still got to make the most of it. Slipstreaming into an opportunity is not enough. It's not enough to be in a market at the right time. You've got to be doing the right things in that market. And so I think there are a number of examples of organizations that did good things. I'm not here to talk about necessarily the stock price performance of Zoom over the last 3 months, other than to say maybe it got a little overheated during the good times during COVID for them. But more importantly, I would say that the feature of companies that thrived during COVID were the ones that didn't expect it was going to be a 1 month issue or a 3 month issue or a 6 month issue, that correctly thought through the implications, supply chain, talent, workplace of the future, et cetera, and were able to pivot their business to be future-proofed, not in years, but in months, that used the beginning of COVID as, the saying goes, a crisis is too good an opportunity to waste, who really saw this as an opportunity to reinvent things they probably should have reinvented some time ago, but didn't have the will to do or didn't have the need to do. Particularly, I would talk about digital transformation, the way of engaging with your employees and your customers in particular digitally, has come leaps and bounds in most industries during COVID. So there is a silver lining to that very dark cloud.
I have another question.
Please, go ahead.
All right. What are the 10 risks that American companies should look at that you referred to earlier? Maybe 3, if that would be okay.
If we go on the sort of law of averages being correct, which is always dangerous, I mentioned before, ESG is number 1 or close to number 1 in most of my clients. Talent, outside of a sort of a narrower DE&I lens, but more broadly talent and the war for talent and the great resignation is usually in the top 3. Cyber, I would say, is still up there. It's certainly in the top 5 for almost all my clients, because it's just, no matter how good you get, the bad guys get better. And there are some very big and nasty bad guys out there, as we've seen in recent months. So I would say those are the ones that are kind of cross-industry and kind of just across corporate America tend to sort of resonate the most. I think ultimately, though, I like companies that in their top 5 have an inability to innovate or an inability to grow or an inability to respond to disruptive competition in their top 5, because that's a predictor of long-term success. for companies is that that is what they think are their most important issues. The others are all important, but they're hygiene issues. And I think kind of dealing with the transformational issues, ESG is certainly transformational, but you know, products and customers are where it's at. If you haven't got those, you don't exist. I think my time is up, so with that, thank you all for your time. I hope you have a great day together today, and look forward to meeting you all later.
Thank you, Mr. Kingsley. At this time,